The colony of Threshold wasn't like other human settlements scattered across the galaxy. There were no bustling markets, no children laughing in playgrounds, no music drifting through the corridors. Instead, an eerie quiet blanketed everything. People moved through the dim hallways like ghosts, communicating through hand signals and text displays that glowed softly in the darkness. Jake Mercer had never known anything different. Born on Threshold 23 years ago, he'd grown up learning to walk quietly, to close doors without sound, to live as if the entire universe was sleeping just beyond the walls. And in a way, it was. The colony existed inside an ancient alien megastructure, something so massive that human minds struggled to comprehend its true size. The walls weren't made of metal or stone but something organic, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Engineers had tried for decades to understand the material, but it defied analysis. It was older than Earth itself, built by beings who'd vanished long before humans ever looked up at the stars. But the real secret of Threshold lay deeper in those walls. The Titans. Nobody knew exactly what they were. Some thought they were machines. Others believed they were living creatures. A few whispered they might be gods. What everyone agreed on was simple: they were enormous, they were powerful, and they were sleeping. And if they ever woke up, nobody knew what would happen. The colony's founders had discovered this truth the hard way. 70 years ago, when the first settlers arrived, they'd celebrated their discovery with cheers and music. The vibrations had caused tremors that collapsed an entire wing, killing 17 people. After that, silence became law. Babies were taught sign language before they could walk. All machinery was designed to operate in near-total quiet. Even footsteps were regulated, with soft padding required on all floors. Jake had broken that silence once. He'd been 5 years old, playing with his older brother Lucas in their quarters. Something funny happened. He couldn't even remember what, and he'd laughed. Not a quiet chuckle but a full, joyful belly laugh that echoed through the corridor. The entire section shook. Light fixtures swayed. Cracks appeared in the walls. People stumbled and grabbed onto railings as the floor vibrated beneath their feet. The tremor lasted only seconds, but the terror lasted much longer. Families evacuated the wing, afraid the ceiling would collapse. Emergency crews rushed in with detection equipment, checking for structural damage. They traced the vibration back to Jake. A 5-year-old boy whose laughter had nearly killed dozens of people. The colony council met in emergency session. Some argued for exile, sending Jake and his family away to protect everyone else. Others proposed monitoring, keeping him under constant surveillance. But Dr. Helen Grant, the colony's chief medical officer, suggested a different solution. Surgery. They could dampen his vocal cords, install implants that would prevent his voice from ever reaching dangerous volumes again. Jake's parents agreed. What choice did they have? Their son's voice was a weapon he couldn't control. He remembered fragments of the surgery. The cold table. The bright lights. Waking up with his throat burning, unable to speak for weeks. When his voice finally returned, it was different. Quieter. Flatter. Safe. But sometimes, late at night, Jake would place his hand against the wall of his quarters and feel something. A vibration so faint it might have been his imagination. A response. As if something enormous was listening on the other side, waiting. Years passed. Jake became an engineer, working on the colony's life support systems. He was good at his job, methodical and careful. People trusted him, though some still looked at him differently, remembering the boy whose laughter had nearly destroyed them all. Then the survey team made their discovery. A group of explorers had ventured into a previously sealed section of the megastructure, using cutting tools so precise they barely made a whisper. Deep in an unexplored chamber, they found it. A data archive, still functioning after countless millennia. The alien language took weeks to partially decode, but what they learned changed everything. The Titans weren't just sleeping. They were listening. Waiting. The aliens who built this place had left detailed logs describing their attempts to communicate with the Titans, to understand their purpose. Test after test, frequency after frequency, trying to find the right sound. The logs ended abruptly. The aliens vanished. The Titans remained. But buried in the data was something terrifying. A specific frequency, a resonance pattern the aliens had identified as the wake sequence. They'd never tested it, too afraid of the consequences. The final entry was a warning in symbols the translation software could barely interpret. The voice that wakes them will either save all or end all. Jake attended the briefing where the council discussed the findings. He sat in the back, watching the data displays show waveform patterns and acoustic analyses. His throat tightened when he saw the frequency chart. Something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't explain why. Dr. Grant saw it too. After the meeting, she pulled Jake aside, her weathered face grave. She showed him recordings she'd kept for 18 years. Audio files from before his surgery. His childhood voice, preserved in her private archive. The waveforms matched. Not perfectly, but close enough to make his blood run cold. His natural voice, the one they'd surgically destroyed, resonated at frequencies eerily similar to the wake sequence. They'd silenced him to save the colony. But they might have silenced humanity's only key to understanding the Titans. Before Jake could fully process this revelation, the sensors detected incoming ships. 3 vessels, military-grade, bearing the insignia of the Ascendancy. A human faction from the inner colonies, known for their aggressive expansion and their belief that humanity's destiny was to dominate the galaxy by any means necessary. Commander Ross's transmission was brief and clear. They'd intercepted Threshold's reports about the Titans. They were here to wake them. And they didn't care who got hurt in the process. The age of silence was ending, whether Threshold was ready or not. The Ascendancy ships docked at Threshold without permission, their magnetic clamps biting into the ancient hull with sounds that made every colonist flinch. Commander Ross and his soldiers moved through the corridors with heavy boots, their very presence a violation of everything Threshold stood for. They didn't whisper. They didn't sign. They talked at normal volume, and the walls trembled faintly with each loud footfall. Jake watched from a maintenance alcove as the soldiers passed, their weapons slung casually across their backs. These weren't explorers or scientists. They were hunters, and they'd come for prey that had been sleeping for millions of years. Ross wasted no time. He commandeered the colony's main assembly hall and laid out his intentions with brutal honesty. The Ascendancy had been tracking ancient megastructures for years, following breadcrumbs left by extinct civilizations. They believed the Titans were weapons, biotech systems designed for war on a galactic scale. Whoever controlled them would control the future of humanity. The council protested. Governor Walsh, a thin man with tired eyes, stood up and tried to explain the danger. They'd lived here for 3 generations in careful silence. They'd lost people learning to coexist with the Titans. Waking them could destroy everything. Ross smiled at that. Destruction was exactly what he was counting on. Just not for humanity. His team began their work immediately, setting up sonic equipment in the deepest accessible chambers. They started with low frequencies, methodical tests designed to map the Titans' neural networks. The colonists felt every pulse. Walls vibrated. Lights flickered. Some people reported headaches that felt like pressure building behind their eyes. On the 3rd day of testing, something responded. It started in Section 7, a residential area near the outer hull. People were eating dinner, communicating quietly through sign language, when the floor buckled. Not violently, but deliberately. It rose and fell like a breath, like something enormous had shifted its weight. Families grabbed their children and ran for the emergency exits. Then the wall opened. Not cracked or broke. Opened. The organic material peeled back like an eyelid, revealing something beyond. It was massive, dark, and it moved with terrible slowness. A limb, maybe. Or a segment of something so large that calling it a limb made no sense. It was the size of a city block, and it had been inside the wall the entire time. 17 people died in the collapse that followed. Dozens more were injured. The Titan segment retreated back into the wall, sealing itself away again, but the message was clear. The tests were working. The Titans were stirring. Jake found Dr. Grant in her office, surrounded by medical reports and casualty lists. She looked older than he'd ever seen her, the weight of every decision she'd ever made pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't look up when he entered. "They're going to keep pushing until something terrible happens," Jake said quietly. "I know," Helen replied. "Ross doesn't care about casualties. He sees them as acceptable losses in pursuit of power. The council needs to evacuate. Get people off Threshold before it's too late." Helen finally met his eyes. "There are 12,000 people on this station. We have transport capacity for maybe 800. And even if we could evacuate everyone, where would they go? This megastructure is our home. Our children were born here. We have nowhere else." Jake sat down heavily. He'd known the numbers, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real in a way that hurt. "There's another option," Helen said carefully. She pulled up a file on her display, the same recording she'd shown him before. His childhood voice, preserved in digital amber. "I've been running simulations. If we removed your implants, if we restored your natural vocal range, You might be able to communicate with the Titans in ways Ross's crude sonic blasts never could. Might, Jake repeated. You don't know for sure. No, I don't. The surgery is dangerous. Your throat has been scarred for 18 years. The implants are integrated with your vocal cords now. Removing them could leave you permanently mute. Or worse, the damage could cause hemorrhaging. You could die on the table. But if it works? Helen leaned back, choosing her words carefully. The alien logs suggest the wake frequency isn't a command. It's a greeting. A question. Ross is trying to shout orders at something he doesn't understand. But you, with your natural voice, you might be able to actually talk to them. Ask them what they want. What they need. Jake thought about his brother Lucas, who died 5 years ago in a mining accident. Lucas had always protected him, stood up for him when other kids made fun of the weird quiet boy with the damaged voice. What would Lucas tell him to do now? The answer came easily. Lucas would tell him to protect people. To be brave when it mattered. Do the surgery, Jake said. The preparations took 2 days. Helen assembled a small team she trusted completely. They couldn't use Threshold's main medical facility because Ross had soldiers stationed there, monitoring everyone who came and went. Instead, they set up in a maintenance bay, sterilizing equipment that had been designed for repairing machinery, not people. Jake's friends insisted on being there. Maya Torres, a tactical analyst who taught Jake how to read star charts, stood guard at the entrance. Derek Cole, a former Ascendancy engineer who defected to Threshold 3 years ago, helped prep the medical equipment. They didn't talk much, communicating mostly through looks and small gestures, but Jake felt their support like a physical presence. The anesthetic was local. Helen needed Jake conscious in case something went wrong, in case she needed him to respond to commands. He lay on the table, staring at pipes and conduits overhead, feeling the cold touch of instruments against his throat. This is going to hurt, Helen warned. The implants have fused with tissue. I'll be as careful as I can, but there's no way to make this painless. Just do it, Jake whispered. She made the first incision, and Jake's world became fire. Hours blurred together. Pain had a way of distorting time, stretching moments into eternities. Jake focused on breathing, on staying still, on not screaming because screaming might bring the Titans crashing through the walls. He could feel Helen's hands working, feel the implants being carefully extracted, piece by piece. Then alarms started blaring. Maya's voice came through the comm, urgent and afraid. They found us. Ross's people are coming. 3 minutes, maybe less. Derek grabbed tools, anything that could be used as a weapon. Maya sealed the entrance, activating emergency locks that would buy them time but not much. Helen's hands didn't stop. Almost there, she muttered. Just need to remove the last anchor point. Jake heard sounds outside. Voices. The whine of cutting torches starting to work on the door. Helen, he tried to say, but his throat was open, his voice box exposed. Nothing came out but a wet gurgle. Done, Helen said, pulling the last implant free. She worked quickly now, sealing blood vessels, stitching tissue. Combat medicine, fast and functional rather than pretty. The door blew inward. Soldiers poured through, weapons raised. Derek threw a wrench that caught one in the helmet, but there were too many. They grabbed Maya and Derek, forcing them to their knees. Commander Ross walked in casually, looking around the makeshift operating room with something like amusement. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with gray hair cut military short and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. Well, he said. This saves me the trouble of finding you. He looked at Jake on the table, at the blood and discarded implants. Dr. Grant, I assume you've just restored his voice. Perfect timing. I was going to have to do it myself, but your methods are probably more refined. Helen stepped between Ross and Jake, scalpel still in her hand. He needs recovery time. The surgery was traumatic. If he tries to speak now, he could tear every repair I just made. Ross pulled out a pistol, not aiming it at anyone in particular, just holding it. A reminder of who had power here. Then I suggest he's very careful about how he uses his voice. Because he's going to help me wake the Titans. And if he refuses, I'll start shooting his friends. 1 every minute until he cooperates. He gestured to his soldiers. Bring him. And someone get him patched up enough to talk. We have work to do. They dragged Jake through the corridors, his throat wrapped in hasty bandages that were already soaking through with blood. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, but he stayed silent. Speaking now would tear everything Helen had just repaired. Ross knew it too. That's why he smiled as they walked, knowing Jake was trapped between physical agony and the threat against his friends. The ascendancy had converted the central chamber into a command center, filling the ancient space with human technology that looked crude and small against the organic walls. Monitors displayed waveform patterns and sonic frequencies. Massive speakers had been mounted at key points, aimed at the walls where sensors detected the strongest Titan presence. Ross forced Jake into a chair near the main console. Maya and Derek were bound nearby, guards standing over them with weapons ready. Helen stood off to the side, her medical bag clutched in her hands, looking helpless for the first time Jake had ever seen. "Here's how this works," Ross said, pulling up the alien data on a large display. The wake frequency pattern glowed there, a series of peaks and valleys that looked almost like music notation. "My people have analyzed these frequencies for months. We can reproduce them mechanically, but the Titans don't respond. They need something organic. Something living. They need a human voice." Jake tried to speak, managed only a painful rasp. Helen stepped forward quickly with water, helping him drink. The liquid burned going down, but it helped. When he tried again, words came out rough and barely audible. "You'll kill everyone." "Maybe," Ross admitted with a shrug. "Or maybe we'll unlock the greatest power in the galaxy. Either way, I'm willing to find out. You should be too. Don't you want to know what they are? What they want?" Despite everything, part of Jake did want to know. He'd lived his entire life on this station, feeling the Titans sleeping beyond the walls. He'd felt them respond to his childhood laughter. They were aware. They were listening. What did they dream about in their endless sleep? Ross saw the curiosity in Jake's eyes and smiled. There it is. That human need to understand. We're explorers, Jake. It's what separates us from animals. We push boundaries. We take risks. Yes, people might die. But people always die. The question is whether their deaths mean something. "Your philosophy is garbage," Derek said from where he knelt. "You're just a bully with weapons, pretending it's about progress." Ross nodded to a guard, who struck Derek across the face. Maya shouted in protest, and another guard pressed a weapon against her head. The room went silent except for Derek spitting blood onto the floor. "Let's begin," Ross said, turning back to Jake. "Start with the first sequence. Low and steady. If you deviate from the pattern, your friends pay the price." Jake looked at the display, at the alien frequencies they wanted him to reproduce. His newly freed vocal cords felt raw and uncertain. He didn't even know if he could hit those notes, let alone sustain them. But with guns pointed at Maya and Derek, he had no choice. He opened his mouth and sang. The sound that came out was nothing like his old voice. It was deeper, resonant in ways that made the air vibrate. The implants had suppressed his voice for 18 years, but they'd also changed it, compressed it, and now that compression was released. The note filled the chamber, echoing off the walls with a richness that made everyone stop and stare. The Titans responded immediately. The walls began to pulse, matching the rhythm of Jake's voice. Lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming on the metal equipment while the organic walls remained warm. Ross watched his instruments with hungry eyes, seeing readings he'd never achieved with his mechanical tests. "Keep going," he commanded. "Next sequence." Jake moved to the second frequency, his voice climbing higher. The pain in his throat was excruciating, but something else was happening. He could feel the station now, feel it in a way that went beyond physical senses. It was like the Titans were inside his head, not as thoughts but as presence. Vast. Ancient. Patient. The third sequence made the floor shake. Colonists throughout Threshold felt it, families huddling together in their quarters, knowing something terrible was happening but unable to stop it. Governor Walsh tried to reach the central chamber, but Ross's soldiers had sealed all approaches. On the fourth sequence, everything changed. Jake's voice hit a note that resonated not just in the chamber but throughout the entire megastructure. Every wall, every corridor, every sealed chamber that humans had never accessed suddenly came alive with light. Bioluminescence spread through the station like wildfire, patterns that looked almost like circuit boards or maybe neural pathways. And then the Titan spoke. It wasn't sound, not exactly. It was vibration that bypassed Jake's ears entirely and registered directly in his brain. Images flooded his mind. He saw the universe as it had been billions of years ago, young and full of light. He saw beings of pure energy and consciousness building structures across the galaxy, creating sanctuaries, preserving knowledge. He saw the silence. It came from beyond the edge of the universe, a wave of absolute nothing that consumed everything it touched. Stars winked out. Galaxies went dark. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years vanished without trace. The Titans and their creators had fled before it, building these megastructures as lifeboats, hoping to outlast the wave. The visions came faster now. The Titans showed Jake their purpose. They were guardians, watchers, designed to sleep until awakened by a species capable of communication complex enough to understand what was coming. They'd been waiting for someone to ask the right question, to engage with them not as tools but as conscious beings. The wake frequency wasn't a command to activate. It was a greeting. Hello. Are you there? Can you hear us? And the Titans were answering. Yes. We hear you. We've been waiting. Ross saw Jake's eyes go distant, saw the way he'd stopped singing and yet sound continued to emanate from him, resonating from his chest and throat without conscious effort. What's happening? What are they showing you? Jake couldn't answer. The visions continued. The Titans showed him their question, the one they'd been asking for eons. Are you ready? Ready to know. Ready to stand. Ready to become what must be. The silence was coming back. It had never stopped. It was still consuming the universe, slower now but inevitable. The Titans had held the line for billions of years, but they were failing. They needed successors. They needed someone to take up the watch. But the cost was everything. To become a guardian meant transformation, meant giving up individual existence to merge with the megastructure, to become eternal and aware but no longer human. It meant watching the universe for millions of years, alone with only the silence for company. The Titans showed Jake what his creators had chosen. They'd accepted the transformation, became part of the defense, and then gradually, over eons, they'd faded. Even transformed beings couldn't maintain consciousness forever. The Titans were the last, and they too were failing. They needed an answer. Would humanity take up the burden? Would they sacrifice themselves to hold back the darkness? Would they transform, evolve, become something greater and lonelier than they could imagine? Ross was shouting now, shaking Jake, demanding answers. But Jake barely felt it. The weight of the question crushed him. How could he answer for all humanity? How could anyone make that choice? Then he understood. The Titans weren't asking him to decide. They were asking if humanity was capable of deciding. If they had the wisdom to choose their own fate rather than having it forced upon them. Jake's voice returned to his control. The resonance faded. He looked at Ross with eyes that had seen the beginning and ending of the universe, and spoke in a voice that sounded wrong, too deep, too layered, as if multiple beings spoke through one throat. They're not weapons. They're guardians. And they're dying. The chamber fell silent. On the displays, the Titan neural patterns showed something that looked almost like sadness. They'd waited so long for someone to understand. And now that someone finally did, they had to ask the terrible question. What happens when the guardians fall and no one is willing to take their place? Ross stared at Jake like he'd lost his mind. The commander had come here expecting weapons, tools of conquest, and instead he was hearing about guardians and sacrifice. His face twisted with frustration and anger. I don't care what they think they are, Ross said, grabbing Jake by the collar. Make them obey. Command them. They respond to your voice, so use it. Order them to serve humanity. Jake shook his head weakly. They don't take orders. They're asking a question. They want to know if we're ready to help them, to become like them. Then tell them yes. Tell them whatever they want to hear. Ross released Jake and turned to his tactical officer. Prepare the full sonic array. If he won't cooperate, we'll force a response through raw frequency bombardment. Derek struggled against his restraints. You idiot. You'll destroy the whole station. The Titans aren't some computer you can hack. They're living beings. Ross pulled his pistol and aimed it at Derek's head. Then I guess Jake better start cooperating before I run out of hostages. But before anyone could move, the station shuddered. Not from sonic testing or Titan movement. From something else. The organic walls began to change color, shifting from their usual dark gray to deep blue, then purple, then colors that didn't have names in human language. The bioluminescence that had spread through the corridors earlier now pulsed with rhythm, like a heartbeat. The Titans were trying to communicate more directly. Images appeared on Ross's monitors without any input from his equipment. Not transmitted through his systems but projected somehow directly onto the screens. They showed Earth, humanity's homeworld, peaceful and blue. Then they showed it dark, consumed by the silence, nothing left but empty space where a planet had been. They showed 1,000 other worlds, all meeting the same fate. Civilizations rising and falling, building and creating, then vanishing into the void. The silence didn't discriminate. It didn't care about good or evil, advanced or primitive. It simply erased everything. Ross lowered his weapon, staring at the screens. For the first time since arriving, he looked uncertain. How long? How long until it reaches us? Jake didn't know how he knew the answer, but he did. The knowledge came through his connection to the Titans, through the resonance still humming in his bones. Millions of years. Maybe tens of millions. The silence moves slowly, but it never stops. Then we have time, Ross said, relief flooding his voice. Time to prepare, to build defenses, to find solutions. We have time, Jake agreed. But the Titans don't. They're failing now. They've held the line for billions of years, and they're exhausted. They're asking if we'll take their place, transform ourselves to become eternal guardians. And if we say no, if we refuse, they want to know what we'll do instead. They want to know if humanity has another answer. The chamber fell silent. Maya spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. What happens if we say no and offer nothing else? The Titans showed them. The megastructures failing, crumbling. The defenses that had held back the silence weakening, collapsing. The wave accelerating, moving faster without resistance. Instead of millions of years, humanity might have thousands. Maybe only hundreds. Ross holstered his pistol. His hands were shaking slightly, Jake noticed. The commander had come here expecting to seize power, and instead he'd learned that all the power in the galaxy meant nothing against the universe's inevitable end. So we have no choice, Ross said bitterly. Transform or die. There's always a choice, Helen said, stepping forward. She'd been quiet throughout everything, watching and listening. Now she looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. The Titans aren't demanding transformation. They're asking if we have wisdom. If we can offer something they haven't considered in their billions of years of existence. Jake understood what she meant. The Titans were ancient and powerful, but they'd been alone for so long. They'd watched civilizations rise and fall, but always from a distance, always as guardians rather than participants. They'd forgotten what it meant to be mortal, to be limited, to be human. An idea formed in Jake's mind. It was crazy, probably impossible, but it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. He stood up, ignoring the pain in his throat, and walked to the center of the chamber. The guards didn't stop him. Everyone was too focused on the displays, on the weight of cosmic extinction. I'm not going to give you an answer, Jake said, speaking to the Titans directly. I can't speak for all humanity. But I can show you what humanity is. What we are when we're not trying to be weapons or guardians or anything except ourselves. Ross started to protest, but Maya elbowed him hard in the ribs. Something in her expression told him to shut up and watch. Jake closed his eyes and thought about his mother. She'd died when he was 12, a simple equipment failure that could have been prevented with better safety protocols. He remembered the song she used to sing to him and Lucas at bedtime. Not a famous song, not even a particularly good one. Just a simple melody she'd learned from her own mother, passed down through generations. He began to sing it. His voice was still raw, still damaged from the surgery, but that didn't matter. The song wasn't about perfection. It was about memory, about love, about the little moments that made life worth living even when you knew it would end. The melody filled the chamber, and something extraordinary happened. The Titans listened. Not analyzed, not processed, not evaluated. They listened the way a person listens to music, with something beyond logic or purpose. The song carried emotion that pure frequency patterns couldn't capture. Joy and sorrow mixed together, hope and grief, all the messy contradictory feelings that made humans human. Jake sang about his mother's hands, gentle when she tucked him in. He sang about Lucas's laughter, loud and infectious. He sang about the first time he'd seen the stars through a viewport, about the wonder he'd felt knowing the universe was so vast and he was so small but somehow that was okay. The song grew, pulling in memories Jake didn't know he had. He sang about the colony's first harvest, when they'd managed to grow actual tomatoes in the hydroponics bay and everyone had celebrated like they'd discovered gold. He sang about old Mr. Patterson teaching children to read, about young Kelly Chen solving an impossible engineering problem, about quiet moments in corridors where people signed to each other and smiled. He sang about humanity's flaws too. The wars, the cruelty, the stupidity. But he sang about them honestly, not trying to hide or justify, just acknowledging that humans could be terrible and wonderful, often at the same time. The Titans began to change. The bioluminescence in the walls shifted patterns, moving in rhythm with Jake's song. It spread through the entire megastructure, reaching sections that had been dark for millions of years. Throughout Threshold, Colonists saw the lights and felt something they couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. Jake's voice began to harmonize with itself, though he was still singing alone. The Titans were amplifying him, adding layers of resonance that turned a simple lullaby into something cosmic. Other voices joined in, human voices. Maya started singing, picking up the melody. Then Derek, his voice rough but earnest. Helen hummed along, tears streaming down her weathered face. Even Ross's soldiers began to sing, hesitant at first, then stronger. The song spread through the communication systems, reaching every corner of Threshold. 12,000 voices joined together, not in perfect harmony but in genuine expression. And the Titans understood. For billions of years, they'd viewed existence as a problem to solve, a duty to perform. They'd forgotten that life could be more than survival. Jake's song reminded them of what they'd lost, what they'd given up when they transformed into eternal guardians. The station shuddered again, but this time it felt different. Gentler. Almost like an embrace. The song faded slowly, voices dropping away one by one until only Jake remained, his voice carrying the final notes into silence. When he finished, the chamber was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, still racing from the effort. His throat burned, but the pain felt distant, unimportant compared to what was happening around him. The walls of the megastructure had transformed completely. What had been dark and dormant now glowed with soft light, patterns flowing through the organic material like thoughts moving through a mind. The Titans were fully awake now, but not in the violent, destructive way Ross had expected. They were awake the way a person wakes from a long, peaceful sleep, slowly and gently. Jake felt their presence in his mind again, but different than before. Not overwhelming or alien. Almost familiar, like talking to an old friend he'd never met. They showed him new images, but these weren't warnings or questions. They were offers. Possibilities. The megastructure began to shift. Not collapsing or breaking, but reconfiguring. Sections that had been sealed for millions of years opened up, revealing spaces humans had never seen. Gardens filled with plants that had evolved in isolation, creating ecosystems that defied Earth biology. Libraries of crystalline structures that stored information in ways human technology couldn't read. And at the heart of it all, chambers where the Titans themselves rested, massive forms that were part machine, part organism, part something entirely beyond human understanding. Ross staggered to a viewport, staring as the station's exterior changed. The hull was separating from the larger megastructure, becoming its own entity. What's happening? What did you do? Jake understood, even though the Titans hadn't used words. They're giving us a choice. They heard the song. They understand that humanity isn't ready to transform, to give up what makes us human. But they also know we need to survive, to have time to grow and figure out our own path. So what are they offering? Helen asked, coming to stand beside him. Threshold is becoming mobile. A ship, but also still part of them. They are sharing their technology, their knowledge, but not forcing transformation. We can travel, explore, find other civilizations, spread the warning about the silence. Or we can stay here and live our lives in peace. It's our choice. Maya looked at the transformed station with wonder. They're trusting us. After billions of years alone, after everything they've seen, they're trusting humanity to make our own decisions. Not just trusting, Jake said, feeling the Titan's gratitude flowing through him. We reminded them of something they'd forgotten. They were so focused on duty, on holding back the silence, that they forgot what they were protecting. Life isn't just about survival. It's about songs and stories, about imperfect moments that matter because they are shared with others. Ross stood silent, his entire worldview crumbling. He'd come here to seize weapons, to secure power for the ascendancy. Instead, he'd witnessed something that made conquest seem small and meaningless. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost humble. What about the silence? If the Titans are failing, if they can't hold it back anymore, what happens? The Titans showed them one final vision. Not a solution, but a possibility. The megastructures across the galaxy, thousands of them, each containing sleeping Titans. If they could be awakened gently, the way Threshold had been awakened, if they could be shown that life still had meaning and purpose, they might hold the line a little longer. Long enough for humanity and other species to grow, to develop, to maybe find answers the Titans couldn't. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't even a particularly good plan. But it was hope, fragile and uncertain, and that was more than they'd had before. We need to tell people, Governor Walsh said, arriving at the chamber with a security team. He'd fought his way through Ross's soldiers, though it looked like most of them had stopped resisting once the song started. The whole colony needs to understand what's happening, what we're being offered. Helen nodded. And they need to vote. This decision affects everyone. We can't make it for them. Ross surprised everyone by agreeing. My people will stand down. I'll face whatever consequences the council decides for our invasion. But first, let's find out what Threshold wants to become. The vote took 3 days. Every colonist over the age of 16 had a say, even Ross's soldiers who were technically prisoners. The debate was fierce. Some wanted to stay, to maintain their quiet life on the now transformed station. Others wanted to accept the Titans' offer, to become explorers and messengers, seeking other megastructures and helping wake them peacefully. Jake didn't vote. He spent those 3 days in the newly opened chambers, learning to communicate with the Titans more clearly. His voice had become something unique, a bridge between human and ancient consciousness. He could speak and the Titans would understand. They could show him visions and he could translate them into words others could grasp. It was exhausting and exhilarating. He was becoming something new, not transformed like the Titans' original creators, but changed nonetheless. A translator. An ambassador. The first human to truly speak with beings older than stars. On the 3rd day, the results came in. Threshold voted to accept the gift, to become mobile, to begin the search for other megastructures. But they also voted to remain a colony, a home, a place where normal human life could continue. They would explore, but they wouldn't lose themselves in the mission. The transformation began immediately. The Titans guided the station's separation from the larger structure, carefully detaching systems that had been integrated for millions of years. It took weeks, but eventually Threshold was free, a ship unlike anything humanity had ever built, organic and mechanical, ancient and new. Jake stood at the edge of the observation deck, watching as the megastructure they'd called home for 3 generations grew smaller behind them. The Titans remained there, still holding their portion of the line against the silence, but no longer alone. They knew now that others were coming, that the message was spreading. Maya joined him, her face reflecting the strange light from the transformed hull. Do you think we'll find them? The other megastructures? Yes, Jake said with certainty. The Titans had shown him star charts, approximate locations of their siblings scattered across the galaxy. It'll take years, maybe decades, but we'll find them. And what will you tell them? How do you wake up a being that's been sleeping for billions of years? Jake smiled, thinking about his mother's lullaby, about the power of simple human moments to touch something cosmic. I'll sing to them. I'll tell them stories. I'll remind them why life matters, why it's worth protecting even when it's messy and complicated and painful. Derek approached carrying a data pad. First destination is locked in. 3.7 light years. The Titans say there's a megastructure there, smaller than this one but still active. We'll arrive in 6 months. 6 months. It seemed impossible that they could cross such distances, but the station moved through space in ways that defied normal physics, riding currents the Titans perceived but humans couldn't measure. They weren't breaking the laws of nature, just using aspects of those laws that human science hadn't discovered yet. Ross was in one of the newly opened sections, working with a team to catalog the Titan technology. The council had sentenced him to community service rather than imprisonment, deciding that his knowledge and skills were too valuable to waste. He'd accepted the judgment without protest, humbled by everything he'd witnessed. Helen found Jake later that evening in his quarters. She checked his throat with medical scanners, satisfied that the healing was progressing well. You'll always have scars, she said. Your voice will never be quite the same as it was before the implants. I know, Jake said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the scars are part of what makes the voice work. The damage, the healing, the journey from silence to song. She smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. Your mother would be proud. You've taken something they meant as a limitation and turned it into humanity's greatest gift. That night, Jake stood in the central chamber where everything had changed, where his song had awakened the Titans. The walls still glowed softly, pulsing with ancient life. He placed his hand against the organic surface and felt them listening. He sang quietly, just for them. Not his mother's lullaby this time, but something new he was composing. A song about journeys and discoveries, about finding family among the stars, about voices that bridge the gap between human and cosmic. The Titans listened, and through them, the universe listened too. Threshold moved through the darkness between stars, carrying 12,000 human lives and one voice that could wake Titans. They were heading toward the unknown, toward other sleeping guardians, toward a future that was terrifying and wonderful. Jake's voice echoed through the corridors, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being heard. His voice wasn't a weapon or a curse. It was a gift, a bridge, a promise that humanity would face the darkness not with silence but with song. And somewhere in the vast emptiness ahead, other titans waited, dreaming their ancient dreams, hoping for someone to remind them why they'd chosen to stand guard so long ago. They wouldn't have to wait much longer. Humanity was coming, and they were bringing music.